An old man sits on a rock at the edge of the sea, and the sea does not end. Not really. Not from where he is sitting. He is somewhere around 90 years old. He has already buried almost everyone he loved. He has already watched Rome execute the people he taught, one by one, in arenas built for entertainment. And now Rome has taken him too. Not to kill him, not yet, but to exile him to a barren island in the Aegean called Patmos, a place with no purpose except to make sure a dangerous old man disappears quietly. You would expect him to be afraid. He has every reason to be. He is alone. He is old. He does not know if he will die on this rock, or if soldiers are already on a boat coming to finish what the arena started. He does not know what tomorrow holds. And yet, when the vision comes, when the sky opens and he falls face down on the stone like a dead man, the first thing the voice says to him is not, "Brace yourself." It is two words that will end up carved into more gravestones, sung in more hymns, and whispered by more dying people than almost any other phrase in human history. We will get to that voice. We will get to what he saw, but not yet. Because to understand why a man staring at the end of the world was told not to be afraid, you have to go back, decades earlier, to a much younger voice, on a hillside in a country the old man had not yet left, speaking to a crowd of people who were not worried about visions or empires, just about ordinary things, what they were going to eat, what they were going to wear, whether they would have enough, whether tomorrow would be worse than today. That voice belonged to Jesus of Nazareth. And what he said that day, on that hillside, is a command so simple you have probably heard it 100 times without ever really hearing it. Do not worry about tomorrow. This is not a video about positive thinking. This is not a video about ignoring your bills, your diagnosis, or your inbox. This is not a video pretending tomorrow will not come. This is a video about a command Jesus actually gave to actual people in a specific moment. And about every place in Scripture where that same command shows up again, on a stormy lake, under a desert tree, inside a Roman prison cell, and finally on that rock in the sea where we started. By the end, you are going to understand something most people miss about this command. It was never really about tomorrow at all. Let's start on that hillside, because you need to see it clearly. It is likely somewhere near the Sea of Galilee, on a slope that could hold a crowd of a few thousand people, sitting on grass and rock in the heat of the day. These are not wealthy people. Most of them are day laborers, farmers, fishermen, people who work today to eat today, with nothing saved for next week. And Jesus looks at this crowd, people who have real, physical reasons to worry about tomorrow, and says something that must have sounded almost insulting at first. He tells them to look at birds. He tells them to look at wildflowers. He says God feeds the birds who do not plant a single seed, and God dresses the wildflowers more beautifully than a king in his finest robe. And then he asks them a question that is really an accusation. Are you not worth more than birds? Here is the word he uses, and it matters. In the Greek text, the word translated worry is merimnao. It does not simply mean to think about. It means to be pulled apart, to be divided in your mind, dragged in two directions at once by something you cannot control. It is the picture of a person who is physically in one place, sitting, eating, lying in bed, while their mind is somewhere else entirely, in a tomorrow that has not happened yet, running through every way it could go wrong. That is the word Jesus uses 4 times in this one passage. Do not merimnao about your life. Do not merimnao about your body. Do not merimnao about tomorrow. Each day has enough merimnao of its own. You know exactly what that feels like. You have lain in bed at midnight with your body perfectly still and your mind running through a conversation that has not happened yet, a bill that has not arrived yet, a diagnosis that has not been confirmed yet. That is merimnao. That is the exact thing Jesus is naming 2,000 years before anyone called it anxiety. Here's what most people miss about this moment. Jesus is not telling this crowd that tomorrow does not matter. He is telling them that tomorrow is not theirs to carry. Sufficient unto the day is the evil thereof, he says. Each day already has enough weight of its own. You were never designed to carry today's weight and tomorrow's weight and next month's weight all at the same time. That is not strength. That is not responsibility. That is a load no human back was built to hold. But Jesus was not the only person in Scripture who had to learn this the hard way. There is a woman named Martha who found this out in her own kitchen, and her story is smaller than the Sermon on the Mount, quieter, almost embarrassing in how relatable it is. Martha has invited Jesus into her home. Her sister Mary sits at his feet, listening. Martha is in the next room, doing everything. The food, the guests, the details nobody else seems to notice or care about. And she is drowning. She marches into the room and does something you have probably wanted to do to someone in your own life. She tells Jesus to make her sister help her, and Jesus does not scold Mary. He turns to Martha, and he says her name twice. Martha, Martha. The kind of repetition you use with someone you love when you can see they are unraveling. And then he says, "You are worried and troubled about many things." Worried and troubled. Two different Greek words stacked on top of each other. One for the anxious, pulling apart feeling we already talked about, and one that means agitated, stirred up, like water someone will not stop disturbing. Martha was not lazy. Martha was not wrong to care about the meal. Martha was drowning in 100 urgent things while missing the one thing that actually mattered in that moment. And if you are honest, you have done exactly what Martha did. You have let 100 urgent, tomorrow-shaped worries crowd out the one thing sitting right in front of you today. Stay with me, because it gets harder before it gets better. Martha's fear was domestic, a dinner party, a sister, a to-do list. But there is a man in the Old Testament whose fear was not about a dinner party. His fear was about staying alive. His name is Elijah, and if you know anything about him, you know him as one of the most powerful prophets in the Bible. He had just called down fire from heaven in front of an entire nation. He had just defeated 450 prophets of a false god named Baal, alone, in public, with everyone watching. This is a man who, 24 hours earlier, had more spiritual authority on display than almost anyone else in the Old Testament. And then a queen named Jezebel sends him a message. She tells him that by this time tomorrow, he will be dead, just like the prophets he executed. And Elijah, the fire caller, the miracle worker, runs. He runs for his life into the wilderness, sits down under a single broom tree in the middle of nowhere, and asks God to let him die. He says it is enough. He says, "Take my life." The Hebrew word used to describe what Elijah felt when he got that message is vayira. He was afraid, from the root yer, a word that means far more than a flicker of nervousness. It describes the kind of fear that hollows a person out, that makes your knees genuinely shake, that convinces you the safest thing left to do is disappear. And notice what triggered it. It was not the 450 prophets. Elijah faced them head on. It was one sentence about tomorrow, one threat about what might happen next. That is what broke him. Not the battle he had already survived, the battle he was imagining. This is not a story about a weak man. This is not a story about a failed prophet. This is not a story about someone who lost his faith. This is a story about what a single frightening tomorrow can do to even the strongest person, if he carries it alone. And here is what God does next, because it is not what you would expect. God does not rebuke Elijah. God does not deliver a speech about how ungrateful he is being after the miracle at Carmel. God lets him sleep. Twice, an angel wakes him up, not to lecture him, but to feed him. Bread, water, rest. Only after Elijah has slept and eaten does God finally speak to him, in a whisper so quiet Scripture calls it a still, small voice. Not in the wind, not in the earthquake, not in the fire. God meets an exhausted, terrified man with food and silence before he meets him with instruction. Pay attention to that, because it tells you something about how God treats a person paralyzed by tomorrow. Not with shame, with bread. There is one more story before we reach the halfway point of tonight, and this one takes place on water, in the dark, in a storm that nearly drowned some of the toughest men Jesus knew. Several of Jesus' disciples were professional fishermen: Peter, Andrew, James, John. These were not soft men. They knew the Sea of Galilee, the way you know the route to your own kitchen. And yet, one night, a storm hits their boat so violently that these hardened fishermen are convinced they are going to die, while Jesus is somehow asleep in the back of the boat. They wake him up, panicked, and he stands, and he speaks 2 words to the wind and the waves: "Peace, be still." And the sea goes flat, instantly, like it had been waiting for permission the whole time. On a different night, on that same sea, in a different storm, Peter sees Jesus walking toward the boat on top of the water, and he does something almost nobody else in Scripture ever does. He asks to walk out there too. And for a few steps, he actually does it. He is out of the boat, on the water, in the storm, walking toward Jesus. And then, you know this part, he looks at the wind. Not at Jesus, at the wind. And the moment his attention shifts from the person in front of him to the tomorrow-shaped danger around him, he starts to sink. Jesus catches him immediately. He does not let him go under. But he asks him a question that is really the whole theme of this video, compressed into 6 words. Why did you doubt? And then he says something in Greek that is almost impossible to translate with the weight it actually carries. Oligopestoi, which literally means little faith one, not no faith, not faithless, little faith. A small, real, sinking amount of faith, which was apparently still enough to get him out of the boat in the first place. And this is where it gets remarkable. Peter's faith was not the problem. Peter's faith was small, and it still worked, right up until his eyes left Jesus and landed on the future. That is the entire pattern this video has been building toward. Martha's hands were full, but her eyes were on the wrong thing. Elijah's body was safe under that tree, but his eyes were on tomorrow's threat. Peter was already walking on water. The impossible thing was already happening. And the moment his eyes moved from the man standing in the storm with him to the storm itself, he sank. Notice what Jesus does not do here. He does not wait on the far side of the water and watch Peter go under as a lesson. He does not deliver a sermon about faith while Peter is still swallowing seawater. Scripture says Jesus reached out his hand immediately and caught him. The rescue comes before the rebuke. The question, why did you doubt, is not asked from a safe distance. It is asked while Jesus is already holding on to him, both of them still standing on water that should not be able to hold either one of them. That order matters. Grace reaches first. The conversation about your fear comes after you are already safe in his grip, not as a condition for it. If you have been holding on so far, here is a good place to catch your breath, because we are about halfway through, and the second half is where this gets even more personal. If any part of Martha, Elijah, or Peter has felt uncomfortably familiar tonight, that is not an accident, and it is worth sitting with rather than scrolling past. If you want the rest of this story, including what this command actually cost Jesus, and what happened to that old man on Patmos we started with, stay with me. And if you are the kind of person who likes having something to come back to on hard nights, subscribing costs you nothing, and it helps this channel keep telling these stories with the accuracy they deserve, which matters more to me than the algorithm does. Here's the part nobody tells you about Jesus and worry. The man who commanded a crowd not to be anxious about tomorrow eventually faced the worst tomorrow any human being has ever faced, and he did not face it with a smile. The night before his crucifixion, Jesus goes to a garden called Gethsemane, and Scripture does not soften what happens there. It says he began to be deeply distressed and troubled. It says his soul was crushed with sorrow, to the point of death. It says he sweat drops that fell like blood. This is not a peaceful, detached teacher calmly reciting his own advice back to himself. This is a man who knows exactly what tomorrow holds. Betrayal, torture, public execution, and something theologians still cannot fully explain, the weight of separation from his own Father. And he asks, 3 separate times, if there is any other way. Let this cup pass from me. This is not a contradiction of everything he taught. This is the proof of it. Jesus does not pretend. Tomorrow does not terrify him. He feels the full weight of it, honestly, out loud, in front of witnesses. And then he says the sentence that turns his own fear into the deepest form of trust anyone has ever modeled. Not my will, but yours be done. He hands tomorrow to his Father while still feeling every ounce of its weight. That is not the absence of fear. That is what faith looks like when it is carrying real fear and refusing to let it drive. You need to see that clearly, because it changes what "do not worry about tomorrow" actually means. It was never a command to stop feeling anything. It was a command about where you put what you feel. A few decades later, a man named Paul writes a letter that says almost the exact same thing Jesus said on that hillside, except Paul writes it from inside a Roman prison, chained to a soldier, waiting to find out whether the Emperor Nero will let him live or have him executed. The Jewish historian Josephus and the Roman historian Tacitus both describe just how brutal Nero's Rome could be toward people who refused to worship the emperor. Tacitus specifically records Nero using Christians as scapegoats after the Great Fire of Rome, having some of them killed in ways almost too horrific to describe. That is the tomorrow Paul is facing while he writes to a small church in the city of Philippi. He does not know if he will be released or executed. And in that letter, he writes, "Do not be anxious about anything." That same word, merimnao, back again. But in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds. Notice the word he chooses at the end. Guard. It is a military word. It means to stand watch, the way a soldier stands watch at a gate, keeping something dangerous out. Paul, chained to an actual Roman soldier as he writes this letter, borrows the language of guard duty to describe what God's peace does to anxious thoughts. It does not eliminate the threat outside the gate. It stands watch at the gate of your heart and your mind, so the threat cannot get all the way in and take over. Paul was not less afraid because his circumstances were less frightening. He simply had somewhere real to hand his fear. The same place Jesus handed his, one dark night in a garden. Picture the actual conditions Paul was likely riding in. Roman imprisonment for someone awaiting trial before the emperor often meant being shackled at the wrist to a guard around the clock, with no privacy, no set release date, and no guarantee the next knock at the door was not the one that ended everything. Josephus, describing the political climate of that same empire, records how quickly accusation could turn into execution for anyone Rome decided was a threat. Paul had every physical reason to spend his nights running through worst-case scenarios. Instead, in that same letter, he writes about learning to be content, whatever the circumstances, in plenty and in want. Not because his tomorrow had gotten safer. It had not. But because he had learned where to stand a guard. There's one more thing, and this is where we go back to where we started. By the time John is exiled to Patmos, he is likely the last living person who walked with Jesus in the flesh. Everyone else is gone. The historian Eusebius, writing the first major history of the church a couple of centuries later, records that John was banished to Patmos during the reign of the Emperor Domitian, one of the most aggressively self-worshipping rulers Rome ever produced, a man who demanded to be addressed as Lord and God, and treated anyone who refused as a criminal. John refused, and John paid for it with the final years of his life spent on a barren, waterless rock in the middle of the sea, cut off from every church he had ever loved, with no idea whether he would ever step foot on solid ground again. You already know what happens next, because we told you at the beginning. The sky opens. John sees a vision so overwhelming that Scripture says he fell down at the feet of this glorified figure like a dead man. Face down, unable to stand, unable to speak. This is not gentle awe. This is the kind of terror that stops a body from functioning. And the very first thing the voice says to him, before anything else, before any explanation, before a single word about what is coming, is this, fear not in the Greek, me phobao. Stop being afraid, right now, in this instant. I am the first and the last. I am the living one. I was dead, and behold, I am alive forever and ever, and I hold the keys of death and Hades. Think about what John is being shown in the chapters that follow. War, famine, persecution. The literal unraveling of human history as he knew it. If anyone in Scripture had a legitimate reason to be consumed by fear of tomorrow, it is a lonely, exiled old man being shown the end of the world. And the very first words he receives are not a warning. They are a command to stop being afraid, spoken by someone who has already walked through death itself and come out the other side holding its keys. This is the moment we planted at the very beginning of this video, finally closing. That old man on the rock, staring at a sea that did not end, was not brave because he had somehow trained himself not to feel fear. He was not afraid in that final moment because the voice speaking to him had already stood in tomorrow's worst possible outcome, death itself, and walked back out of it. The same voice that told a crowd on a hillside not to worry about tomorrow. The same voice that asked a sinking fisherman, "Why did you doubt?" The same voice that sweat blood in a garden and still said, "Not my will, but yours." That is the voice standing in front of John, holding the keys, telling him to stop being afraid. Here is where this stops being an ancient story and starts being about you, because you already know what it feels like to lie awake, staring at a ceiling instead of a sea, running through a version of tomorrow you cannot control. Maybe it is a diagnosis you are waiting on. Maybe it is a job that might not exist in 6 months. Maybe it is a child you cannot protect from a world that feels less safe every year, and you check on them one more time before you finally fall asleep, not because checking changes anything, but because the worry has to go somewhere. That is merimnao. That is the exact thing Martha felt in her kitchen, and Elijah felt under his tree, and Peter felt when he looked down at the water, and John felt when the sky tore open in front of him. You are not weak for feeling it. Every person in this video felt it too. But every single one of them was met the same way. Not with a lecture about how they should be stronger. With presence. With bread, in Elijah's case. With a hand that caught Peter before he went under. With a father Jesus could hand his own terrifying tomorrow to. with a voice that said fear not before it said anything else to John. Tomorrow was never yours to carry alone in the first place. It was never supposed to be. You know the version of this that happens in your own house. It is the parent standing in a doorway at midnight, watching a child breathe just to be sure, then lying back down and doing the math on a future they cannot control. College, health, the news, a world that feels less predictable every year. It is the phone glowing in the dark at 3 in the morning, one more scroll through a headline that will not change by morning but somehow feels urgent to keep checking. None of that is a character flaw. It is a human being who was never built to hold tomorrow, trying to hold it anyway, alone, in the dark. The same command that reached a Galilean crowd, and a terrified prophet, and a sinking fisherman, and a chained prisoner, and an exiled old man is reaching into that doorway too, and into whatever room you are sitting in right now. So here is what this comes down to, and I want to leave you with 3 things. The first is simply true, whether you feel it or not. Jesus' command not to worry about tomorrow was never a suggestion to stop caring. It was a redirection of where your care goes, off your own shoulders, and onto a God who is already there, in every tomorrow you have not lived yet. The second is about you, specifically. The anxious, 3 in the morning, running through worst-case scenarios version of you is not disqualified from faith. Martha still got to sit with Jesus after her outburst. Elijah still got to hear God's voice after he asked to die. Peter still got caught, not condemned, when he sank. Your worry does not put you outside of God's reach. It is often the exact place he meets you. And the third is the one I actually want you to sit with tonight, after you close this video and the room goes quiet again. The same voice that told a frightened old man on a rock in the sea, "Fear not, I hold the keys," is not distant from whatever tomorrow you are afraid of right now. He has already stood in the worst tomorrow anyone has ever faced, walked out the other side of it, and he is telling you the same 2 words tonight that he told John. Fear not. I want to know something, honestly. Out of everything in this video, Martha's kitchen, Elijah's tree, Peter sinking beneath the waves, Jesus in the garden, or John on that rock, which one hit closest to home for you? Tell me in the comments, because I read every one, and I would genuinely like to know which tomorrow you are carrying right now. Thank you for spending this time with me. I will see you in the next